the words of the Jews for boycotting Israeli goods banner, it's kosher to boycott Israeli goods. It's not anti-Jewish to boycott Israeli goods. And so they do a lot of running interference for other groups who are being accused of anti-Semitism, which is very useful and unfortunately very necessary. A lot of work, actually, funny enough, that they do, especially in the US, but also in Holland, is church work. When churches try and divest from Israel, they're customarily slapped with the accusation of being anti-Semitic and carrying on Christian anti-Semitism. And so having these groups here saying, no, we're working with them to forward this divestment thing is very useful on this thing. So that's in the wider world. They do this. Within, and they have a kind of very clear and very useful purpose. Within the community, it's a bit, among fellow Jews, it's a bit more murky. On one level, there is a kind of grudging acknowledgement of this growing opposition to Israel. And so in Britain, for instance, during Cast-Led, while you did have the Board of Deputies of British Jews organising a pro-Israel rally during Cast-Led, you had at the same time rabbis representing about, I'd say, over a quarter of British Jews writing a letter into the papers saying Israel should have a ceasefire. So there is a kind of somewhat of a shift among the more liberal elements of the Jewish community, and increased acknowledgement that Zionism, which was a source of consensus in the community, a source of strength, a source of whether we disagree about everything else, we can agree about Israel, is no longer that. It's now a source of dissent, and this, in a way, disembeds Zionism from being Jewish. So that's one thing, but mainly what they promote in the community is a real visceral, I can't put it any other way, hatred. So you'd have something like the right-wing columnist Melanie Phillips calling a group like Independent Jewish Voices, a very moderate British group, Jews for genocide. And you have the usual thing that not just they're self-hating, but they're also anti-Semitic fellow travellers. And you have loads of this stuff thrown at these groups, and it's actually not just textual, because one of the things that these groups do, well, they also, of course, do lobbying and education meetings, but they also do protests. And I've got a description of some protest that people from the British group, the main British groups, Jews for Justice for Palestinians, were on. A couple of protests from one of the people involved. And she says about it, "We were corralled away from the crowds and protected by the police. Hot coffee was thrown at us. We were told that the wrong Jews died in Auschwitz, and they tried to come into our space with the Israeli flag." Now these are Zionists, by the way, who are saying this. When we protested in Golders Green, which is an area in North London which has a large Jewish population, when we protested in Golders Green against the separation wall, one of our number was physically attacked and needed hospital attention. I also protest against fascists. They use the same intimidatory tactics and often inspire the same fear. The behaviour of the people at the rally is indefensible and is a product of their world where force, not reason, rules the day. Now, the writer of that, actually, a wonderful woman, she's about 75 years old, and I'm just really impressed that she's also out there protesting against fascists. So if you're thinking, if they're getting all this hassle, and the hassle isn't simply from the community, people would be talking about members of the family who arguing something in the family. The question is, then why bother do this? Why not get into something nicer? Like free Tibet or something that wouldn't cause as much hassle within the community and the family. And if we talk about why doing it, I mean, there's always been Jewish opposition to Israel, and if we think of the Jewish opposition, it's been religious and been secular. And I think it does come from the same source. The religious opposition has been sometimes misinterpreted as being religious leaders were against the state of Israel because they thought there shouldn't be a state of Israel before the Messiah arrived. And it's only when the Messiah arrived then this proper state of Israel could be established, and until then this is wrong. And I think this is a complete misinterpretation of what religious anti-Zionism is about, which doesn't come from that much of a different place to secular anti-Zionism. Because what it's about is, it's that Jewish life is diasporic. Intrinsically, Jews belong in the diaspora. This is where the Jewish religion really was formed, was through the diaspora attachments. If you talk about rabbinical Judaism, it was formed in the diaspora. And the idea that living in Galut, living in the diaspora, is an intrinsic part of being a Jew. Now that has got modern resonance. This idea that like Jewishness is part of the diaspora, because Jewish people nowadays have increasing comfort in the diaspora, in every area of major settlement, which, as I say, most Jews live in Western Europe, in North America. Jewish people experience relatively little anti-Semitism. Of course, there's anti-Semitism, but it's not like state policy the way it was in the past. It's not as serious as racisms against outgroups. And there's no such thing as state anti-Semitism. Any existence of anti-Semitism as is always stamped down upon. So, for the first time, actually, this has happened in most major area of Jewish settlement, and Jewish people in the diaspora are comfortable. It is a nice place to be living. So there's this element of thinking, well, yeah, the diasporic condition, rather than a condition of like going into a small nation state somewhere in Asia, is the normal way of being Jewish, which is increasingly, not simply among people who disagree with Israel, an increasing thing that's happening. And it's also caused because of the increasing distance with Israel. Because in the diaspora, as I say, living in Western liberal democracies, which are growing increasingly diverse, that's going in the different direction to what Israel's going. Because Israel is becoming increasingly ghettoized. Israel is becoming increasingly closed. Israel is becoming, let's face it, increasingly racist, especially over the last few years. And I'm not just talking about the kind of racist laws of the government, but I'm talking about issues of like pogroms that are happening against Palestinians in Haifa. Be talking about stickers that are appearing on shops claiming this shop doesn't employ Arabs, and so on and so forth. So when diaspora Jews brought up in liberal democracy goes to this place, it seems increasingly foreign, increasingly distant. And so there's increasing disillusion, both with official Zionist institutions, which are seen as unrepresentative, and with Israel. And it especially comes to the fore whenever there's a war. One of the older activists who was turned in the 1973 war kind of quipped to me that like every fresh war with Israel brings us a fresh crop of recruits. And of course, since 2000, Israel's wars have been happening with increasing regularity. But the wars might kind of bring the stuff to the surface, but it's more long-term kind of distance that has been created. And again, so I'd just like to kind of quote about this kind of long-term process of distance, not just the disillusion with Israel, but also with the official institutions. I'm quoting from an interesting character, Peter Beinart, and he wrote this article, I think it was last year, in 2010, he wrote this article in the New York Review of Books, where he kind of talked about this disconnect that younger Jews have with Israel. It was very significant because it was in the New York Review of Books, and because Peter Beinart was one of the kind of pillars of the Jewish establishment. And what he said was, several decades, the Jewish establishment has asked American Jews to check their liberalism at Zionism's door. And now, to their horror, they're finding that many young Jews have checked their Zionism instead. And it's the attitude which Philip Weiss actually satirizes as saying that these Jews are pet. They're progressive except for Palestine. But increasingly, younger Jews are progressive, including Palestine. So it's saying it like this, it seems like a really inevitable process, a natural process of gradual distancing. But of course, for the individual Jewish people themselves doing this, it's often quite a painful process, and often quite difficult. And often it's done as kind of Damascene conversion, that one day you kind of just realize the scales fall from your eyes and you realize, oh God, I've been supporting this all along. And for quite a lot of them, it happens in Israel, seeing the reality of either Israeli racism or the oppression that goes on in the West Bank. But it doesn't necessarily happen because of that. Sometimes it happens because of experience of this official Jewish community. And I've got a lovely kind of quote, another little quote here, about an English friend of mine who was talking about like what finally turned him. And what turned him was the 1981 Shabra Shatila massacre in Lebanon. And what actually affected him, which was the British Jewish response to the massacres. And what he says is, I went to shul, which is the Yiddish term for synagogue. I went to shul after it happened with my mum. And the rabbi applauded what had happened. He said, oh, we know what the PLO is after, and the anti-Semitic press, saying all these terrible things about Jews. Who are we to lecture Israel? And I didn't walk out, but I said to my mum, I'm never going back there again. And I never went back to shul again for anything, apart from bar mitzvahs, weddings and funerals. And I kind of like the last line, because it indicates that while Israel's being rejected, while communal Zionism is being rejected, Jewishness is not being rejected. And for many people in this group, especially secular Jews, that being involved in this group, in such groups, is a way of actually reclaiming their Jewishness, of saying there's something more to being Jewish